Hello, welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Marites Vitug, and joining us is Ronald Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government. Our conversation with Dean Mendoza will take off from this book. I will show it to you. It's so heavy. Okay, some are smarter than others. The history of Marcos' crony capitalism. By the way, in a few weeks, we will mark the 48th anniversary of martial law in the country. Anyway, this book was first published in 1991, and the author Ricardo Manapat unfortunately died in 2008. The Ateneo University Press decided to reissue his book with annotations. That's why it's very heavy and thick. And Dean Mendoza wrote the foreword to this recently released 2020 edition. Thank you, Ron, for joining us in this conversation.
My pleasure, Marites.
Yes, so maybe I'll start off with you had to read the book again. I'm sure you were very young in 1991 when this was first published. What struck you most when you had to reread the book recently?
Well, it it brought back a lot of memories, a lot of angst about our nation. Um, Sadly, what I sensed was a lot of what I read in the book. We were already witnessing yet again, and we have witnessed during the Marcos era, but also in the post-Marcos era. So some of the things that Rick actually wrote about, we tend to relive again, over and over again.
How come we never learn lessons from our past? I mean, we keep repeating the same mistakes.
I do think we sort of underestimate ourselves and always say that we never learned our lessons. I think we do. I think there's enough of us who understand what needs to be done, but it's not easy. And we haven't yet figured out and implemented the entire institutional reform agenda that will bring us further away from oligarchy and closer to a democratic and citizen empowered governance that we really aspire for. So I would like to be fair to our country. We have progressed in since the post Marcos era, and that's why before COVID-19 we had one of the most robust and fastest growing economies in Asia and the world. We are not perfect. Certainly, we have high inequality. We still have poverty. We have issues of governance. We have populist tendencies, but we have managed to achieve many things. So it's important to actually have a very objective but also balanced view of what we achieved and what we still have yet to achieve.
So I understand that this book, Some Are Smarter Than Others, was reissued to counter the drift towards historical revisionism. The Marcoses are back. People seem to have forgotten. So why are we seeing the return of the Marcoses? I mean, 49 years ago, Marcos declared martial law that was lasted 14 years, and so many bad things happened then. So why are they back?
Well, first of all, I'm an academic and a scholar, so my real interest is not really particularly about families, but about our systems and the types of issues, institutional reform issues that we need to really converge around and get the job done. So your question is, why are some of these people back? I think they never left. If you ask me, they've always been around. They've been laying low. Our governance is such that it involves compromise, which is probably the way of politics, but also accountability is highly imperfect. So part of the accountability agenda has not really been fully implemented, and so much of the wealth that was stolen was never really returned. Many of those responsible cut deals in order for government to also move on, for the nation to move on. As you know, the primary struggle after the fall of the dictator was to come out of a very, very deep economic contraction and political crisis, and also a very big debt crisis. So fighting those battles then and further dividing the nation may not have been um, such an effective way of getting us out of those challenges. So compromises were made, and those compromises come at a cost. Institutions were built, particularly economic institutions, hence the progress that we've seen in the past few decades. But political institutions remain stunted. And so those political institutions are probably responsible for some of what we witnessed during the Marcos dictatorship and continued malgovernance that we are still witnessing today. So that's really the uneven and imbalanced development, both economic and political, that we've seen thus far. The challenge, therefore, is to wake up our young people to that nuanced view of where we are right now, because it's so easy to be seduced by this message that everything is a failure. Everything after the dictatorship was actually not effective. It brought us to even worse levels. This is the kind of revisionism that we're hearing. And I think the way to respond to this in an objective and even tone is that we are still highly imperfect. No one is actually contradicting this. We are still working on both our politics, our economics, our society, and how we're still quite divided between a very developed north and a very underdeveloped south. But the thing, if we are unable to appreciate what we are building, we may stop the building process altogether and go back to more destructive ways of governing our country. So I think that's the important message I want to impart to the young people out there. I first read this book when I was a teenager. And just like many young people today, I guess they're quite angry. They want to direct that anger somewhere. But I would like to challenge them to direct it towards a positive and productive direction, not just against what we don't want, but towards what we really want and what we're trying to build.
So, is this, when you refer to political institutions, that includes Congress, and that's where maybe the reforms legislation is one of the major areas where reforms can take place. If you were to, I'm sure you've proposed already major legislative agenda to building institutions and reforming. What would be the first, what's your first priority?
Well, I shouldn't claim to have done this myself. We always try to do this with a group, with the network, and with the coalition. And thankfully, actually, many have started advocacy even before my time. So this is really just a continuing effort by a very, very big group of people who are now trying to continue to push for the reform. There are many different reforms. I'm an economist. I always get mistaken to be either a lawyer or a political analyst. I am not. I'm actually an economic development specialist. This is my main focus. But in terms of economic development, you look at politics, you look at society, you look at governance, public administration. So that's sort of my area. So many of my fellow economists, like the hammers that we are, we see a nail. The solution is an economic one, right? So the interpretation is that we need to go and develop. And through that development, we grow a middle class. So this is basically the theory of change, right? And with the middle class, you actually continue to sustain that kind of hunger for reform. And so, long story short, the answer to your question, it's a whole bunch of economic reforms. We've been doing really good at that, actually. And if you ask me, past 2 decades or so, and it's been paying off through the high growth. At least prior to COVID-19. We don't know yet during the new normal and post-COVID scenario how we will do. But so far, we have been holding our own and sort of growing our economy. The challenge, however, is, as you mentioned, not just economic. So we cannot just stay within our comfort zone. And certainly, I think the political reforms need to catch up with the economic reforms. So there seems to be an overemphasis on economic reforms and an overemphasis on the theory of change that is latched onto economic progress. and economic growth. I do think that we still fail to elect leaders that we can hold accountable. That's a very, very basic message. If you elect a leader, can you hold that leader accountable? And clearly, we've been seeing a lot of evidence that we cannot. Leaders who have been convicted manage to get out. Leaders who make mistakes don't get convicted, don't get held accountable, and still manage to keep running and actually winning in elections. And all manner of impunity is practiced by some of these leaders. I'm not saying all, I'm saying some of these leaders. And then you look at the system, and it's a system that is not really very democratic anymore. If you think about it, it's a system dominated by political families, by political clans. There is little appreciation for checks and balances, for conflict of interest, for many other things that should be healthy and strong in a democracy. So I think the political reforms that need to be introduced, there are many, but strengthening decentralization is certainly one of them. So I really, really appreciated the efforts of credible leaders like Senator Nene Pimentel when he was still with us, pushed for his ambitions on federalism. I can appreciate that. But non-credible efforts to push for these ideas that actually contradict the very essence of federalism, we should put a stop to that, because that's just taking advantage of the messaging, but actually is after something totally different. I think the continued reforms in our elections to strengthen the integrity of our electoral system would be good. I think we have not yet figured out how to stop vote buying. It's been with us since the birth of this democracy, even before Marcos, even after Marcos. It's happening right in our face, and we are unable to stop it. As a people, as a democracy, this is a slap in our face. Tons of research in this area, and yet it seems our institutions appear powerless against it. And then also we need to level the playing field. And obviously an anti-dynasty law or a dynasty regulation law might actually help, but it's not the only thing we need to do. It's costly to run for office. Very credible and very talented people with high integrity, but with no resources, are not able to run. Part of the challenge is our political parties don't behave like political parties, so we need to strengthen them. But in order to strengthen the baby must actually drink the medicine, right? So we can only bring the reform to them, but if there is no real change from many of our leaders, from many of these parties, then we continue to see the malaise that we see today.
Yes, in your foreword, you put an emphasis also on corruption as a major problem, and you said that the factors that enable corruption are monopoly of power, discretion, and weak accountability. You discussed already weak accountability, but do we still have monopoly of power despite the three co-equal branches of government sharing supposedly equal power?
That's a good question, and in fact, by definition, the fall of a dictator should actually suggest that there is no single monopoly of power anymore. And so now I think is the more nuanced interpretation of what is happening to us. In fact, I would like to refer to a narrative shared by my good friend, attorney Alex Lacson, who said that we were able to kick a dictator out of Malacanang, but we are unable to kick the many mini dictators in each of the provinces. And these mini dictators are actually the political clans, right? So it's a nuanced interpretation of what's happening to us. We decentralize in a way some of the power. It ended up in some of our regions, in our provinces, but those provinces within their borders got quickly captured by very powerful families. And they are being contested by very powerful families, not by powerful ideas, not by powerful reforms, not by credible political parties. They are being contested by powerful individuals and powerful families. So the system of governance actually is built around this contest. And this contest is not necessarily producing the inclusive economic development that we all want, nor the good governance that we all want. And certainly, it's not producing citizens' empowerment. So it's important to say that these many mini dictators who are out there in the country, and they're seen in cities, they're seen in the countryside. The degree to which you can push back on them tempers their impunity. Our interpretation is that if you're in a city with an Ateneo, with the LaSalle, with the UP, with the UST, with the UE, with an FEU, these powerful individuals cannot just practice impunity. If you have media, if you have Rappler, well, we used to have ABS-CBN, not anymore. That's actually troubling. But if you have these institutions that can push back, you have business, you have church groups, you have civil society, then even though they have concentrated some power, they cannot practice the impunity that could be practiced in places like Maguindanao or Lanao del Sur or Sulu. And there, where you don't have the pushback, where you don't have the checks that we may have in the cities, in the more developed areas, where we have maybe the bigger middle class, then the risk of impunity is very, very high. So I think it's important to understand that it goes in layers. First is the concentration of power in a few political families. Then there is the absence of that democratic pushback. Then there is the opportunity for impunity that occurs. Now, the other side of the story, of course, is that you actually took out a dictator in Malacanang, but there are still powers in the presidency that actually help create some of the very bad relationships that we see, the bad governance that we see. And that's I'm referring to here is the pork barrel relationship that actually holds Congress back, which is why every Congress and every president tends to be bound together in this. Well, essentially, it's a mutually enforcing behavior where the president needs all of Congress in order to get all that power, and Congress cannot really practice its oversight role because it needs the money and the resources. So that's the kind of bad governance and bad equilibrium that we have right now that we hope through institutional reforms, through ideas like deep decentralization, dare I say federalism, but the right kind, not the bogus kind. We're actually envisioning rebalancing that power so that not everything is in the center. You actually have some agility in the local governments, but at the same time, with that agility, with those resources, must come accountability. So we must be able to hold them accountable also to what they're going to do with that additional power from the center.
You just reminded me, Ron, about the lack of media presence now in the provinces because 54 regional TV and radio stations of ABS-CBN just went off the air. But anyway, also in your foreword, what struck me was that you said no leader can fix the nation's problems because we're all thinking, if we vote for a good president, then he can solve the problems. And you said only institutions and stronger democratic governance can bring about sustained and inclusive development. But leaders can destroy institutions, right? So how do we build institutions that are very sturdy and can't be weakened by bad leaders?
Well, I think that's essentially the innovation of every democracy that lasts. And that's the difference between a country that remains less developed and not really a rich and powerful country, and those that eventually make it to becoming a much more developed and much more stable democracy. I think there are many elements to this. Institutions, first of all, the first lesson I think I gather from international literature and international best practice is that institutions tend to reinforce each other. If they are good institutions, then they will reinforce each other in very good and stable ways. For instance, if you have an independent Congress, then the president will not make so many mistakes. And you may have good appointments, not bad appointments to particular agencies. And if there's any attempt at corruption or any attempt at impunity, the mere threat of Congress, the mere threat of the accountability mechanisms is enough to actually mitigate the worst of it. So that you actually have a credible threat as far as the accountability mechanism is concerned. So that's how good institutions sort of reinforce each other. Unfortunately, if you have enough bad institutions, they also will reinforce each other, right? So if you have a pliant Congress that doesn't really exercise its oversight role, then a lot of mistakes can happen in budget allocations, in major projects. And there's going to be very little checks against a very powerful president. He could go on appointing, or she could go on appointing officers of the state with no or little expertise. And they would be not held accountable for their lack of expertise and lack of progress in terms of pushing the reform agenda, or maybe even having a reform agenda to begin with. So I think if you have that kind of an environment, and then when you see this, where loyalty is a primary consideration over expertise, over integrity, then everyone starts to behave to earn loyalty, which is the worst kind of behavior. I call it people auditioning to be noticed and appointed to positions of power. That kind of bureaucratic incentive is totally destructive and should be stopped, because the worst of us will actually rise. The worst of us will emerge to actually head many of these institutions. And given that kind of leadership, the rest of the bureaucracy will actually be discouraged. You will actually deter many good, talented young people from actually joining government. So that kind of an environment, that kind of decay, that kind of cancer, is the kind of decay and cancer that we saw under the Marcos dictatorship. So it's slowly coming back. We're seeing some of the signs, and we must put a stop to it. And I think there's enough of us on the checks and balances side to actually speak truth to power and actually try to stop it, also for its own good, because that is a very self-destructive tendency for some of our leadership and some of our institutions. So I think that's also what we need to work on.
Yes, and also speaking about cronies, oligarchs, this is also a favorite subject of President Duterte. He says that he's been fighting oligarchs, and he was able to put down one, the Lopezes, after ABS-CBN was shut down. So, but of course, oligarchs remain, cronies remain. So is this populist, for you, is this populist rhetoric? Because he defines himself against his enemy, that's the oligarchs. Or is this the reality, and we will have to live with oligarchs until all the reforms you've talked about are achieved?
Well, in fairness to our president right now, that is a very popular messaging, by the way, because it resonates with many, many individuals who see the inequality that is staring us in the face as far as this country is concerned. And finally, here's this leader who is not going to pretend. He's going to call a spade and say, I'm going to take down this particular family, this particular powerful individual, powerful company. The challenge with this, however, is one, we have heard this before. And if a head of state is indeed serious about taking down this pattern of power concentration, right? The focus needs to be not on individual families or individual companies, but on the system. Because the system keeps on producing powerful families and powerful individual companies. There's nothing wrong with a powerful company. There are many things wrong with the powerful single family, however. So that's the big distinction between. That's why I said to media that I think the oligarchs of this country today are not in business. They are in politics. And there is more money to be made in politics. That's why they actually migrated there. And now they are actually going after business, depressing some of these wealthy families, wealthy companies, and basically exerting their political and economic power even more, right? And I think the best way to think about this is to think of the system. The system is such that we allow them to concentrate power either on the economic side, on the business side, or on the political side. Now, let's start with the economic side first. If you are concentrating economic power, meaning wealth, meaning size, meaning reach, such as what some of our conglomerates now have. Personally, as an economist and as a development researcher who has seen the development of other countries, size is not necessarily a problem. The challenge is when you use that size to depress the growth of other firms. And you use that size to actually depress competition and protect yourself from competition. So the trick then would be, yes, let's allow you to reach some size, but guess what? Remember, we're going to expect you to export and duke it out with the rest of the big companies out there in the international arena. That is actually what the Southeast Asian and East Asian tigers did with their large conglomerates. That is why they did not turn out to be such big rent-seeking entities. The way to apply, to temper the power concentration in these particular firms was to force them out to compete. So it was the competitive pressure of the international arena that actually geared them towards the right kind of size, the right use of their size and power, right? So you need size to actually penetrate the US market, the European Union market, and the Japanese market. Because otherwise, if you're just a small firm, you will never get there. You'll never compete with their big firms, right? So size is forgivable on the economic side. You must be forced to compete. And if you cannot compete here in the country with 110 million people, compete out there in ASEAN where you have something like 800 million people. Compete out there in the North American and European markets where you have even more competitors to face. So that's the economic side. On the political side, uh, I find it difficult to imagine how size can be good in any way. Because the way that size manifests itself in the political sphere is through fat political dynasties. You virtually occupy so many positions in office. And if that's what you're trying to do, some of them say that, Prof. Ron, you know what, with my father who is a governor and my sister who is a congressman, we can together do many great things for this province. And some of them actually start out that way. Let me give them a little bit of credit for that. But the thing is, that kind of concentration of power has no competition tempering it. That is the difference between the economic side, where you force them out to compete in the international arena. Here, in the political sphere, where in a province, give any Philippine province, and you have the governor, the vice governor, the mayor, the congressman, the provincial board member, all related in one political family. There is very little tempering of that power concentration, and therefore, the likely practice of impunity, where you are not going to be able to correct something that is already wrong, is very, very high. So that's the big difference between the two. So you ask me, okay, why are we seeing this all over again? Where the oligarchs? How can we actually address them? Well, if we are willing to apply competition on the economic side, let more players in, but regulate them. You know, you don't just let so many Chinese investors in, but they don't practice good mining practices. or they don't practice good labor practices. uh, Let them in, let the Europeans in, let the Chinese in, let the Americans in, but they follow our regulations. And the playing field is a level playing field. That's fine. But let's have more of them come into our country and apply competition to our own firms. And our own firms, let us actually give them the message and the incentives to go out there and find export markets for us. That's the first part. We've been actually doing some good in that area already. That's why we're seeing a lot of good economic progress in the past few decades. On the political side, applying more competition to the political system, that is where we're failing miserably and lacking still many political reforms that could actually push for competition in the political sphere.
Wow, that's an entire agenda for the country to take up, Ron. And may I just remind our viewers before we end this conversation that this book is available. This is, as Ron said, to remind us of our history, crony capitalism. It's available in Shopee, Lazada, and ateneopress.org. So thank you very much, Dean Mendoza, for that enlightening conversation. And we hope that our young viewers have also latched onto the more nuanced messaging. And you gave us some hope. It's not all that bad. Look, have the long view.
Oh, it's always there's always a lot of hope. You're talking to a martial law baby that lived through some of the worst parts of our history. So what I see now, there's a lot of bad. Obviously, there's a lot of areas for improvement, but I've seen far worse actually. So I think young people have a lot of things to hope for, but they must direct their energies along with the rest of us and lead us maybe in this effort at pushing for those reforms that we really need at this stage.
Thank you so much. And to our viewers, we will continue this conversation with other resource persons. And thank you again and goodbye.